Okay, now we're jumping into the meat of chapter one of the book. So, the objective of information security is to protect each of us, our economy, and our critical infrastructure. So, the book starts at a very high level from a national policy perspective. And we do know that the inadvertent or intentional misuse or compromise or destruction of information happens. So the government jumps in, right? The services provided by critical infrastructure sectors are the backbone of our economy. And so critical infrastructure are assets, systems, and networks, whether they're physical or virtual. And we can apply that in our companies too. So at the highest level of the government, they recognize security issues from a cyber sense. And then the book on page 3 references PDD, Presidential Policy Directive 7, which required federal departments and agencies to identify and prioritize critical infrastructure to protect them against physical and cyber terrorist attacks. We should be doing that within our companies. 10 years later, there was PDD 21. This was in 2013. And that's a critical infrastructure security and resilience. We talk about resilience a lot in cybersecurity, which broadened the cyber effort. So, policy, as we know, is this seminal tool used to protect both our critical infrastructure and balance that with the business needs and our individual liberties. So the role of policy is to provide the direction and structure at a high level. Policies become the foundation then of operations, part of our rule of law. If you've had the ethics class, ethics and law would apply here. And without policies, we live in a state of chaos and uncertainty. And the impact of policy can be positive or negative. So we always want to be cautious about that. Okay. These are the objectives for the slides that we're about to go over and chapter 1. So, as I mentioned, policy is that seminal tool to protect our infrastructure, especially our critical infrastructure, and balance that with the business needs and the individual liberties. And a definition is applied here. It's a definite course of action or procedure selected from among alternatives and in light of a given condition to guide and determine present and future decisions. So policy is going to drive standards, procedures, and guidelines in our cybersecurity world. Okay, so we can take a step back and look at history. History is always helpful, right? The book talks about policy through the ages. Ideas do seem more credible when we begin with an understanding of A, what's been around for a long time, and B, if it's been around for a long time, it's withstood the test of time. Remember, it's about reducing chaos in our culture. So the book on page 4 references the Bible, for example, which goes back, 3,500 or so years, discusses the Torah, for example, which were the first 5 books of the Bible. And it articulated a codified social order, and they give some examples in the book about that. I would even reference Hammurabi's Code was an important law code. It was in Mesopotamia during the reign of the Babylonians, right? And the code was a list of laws written by King Hammurabi during his reign, and they were special because it was the first law code to include laws to deal with everyone in the current society, right? He made up almost 300 rules that they should follow and a couple of laws among them. And it was not discovered until 1901. They were written on a pillar that was discovered. So, examples in the code. If a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. If a man strikes a freeborn woman so that she lose her unborn child, he will pay 10 shekels for her loss. If a slave says to his master, "You are not my master," if they convict him, his master shall cut off his ear. Rough, okay? I'm not here to justify it. I'm just sharing history, right? So basically, what we're going to talk about later in the course is that our policy reflects our culture and even our corporate culture, right? So they will change over time, there's no doubt. So these are all behaviors, whether you're looking at something in the Bible or you're looking at Hammurabi's code. These are behavior directives, or what we now refer to as policies, right? And so the various common experience of all people have led to common behaviors and choices. And if everyone followed the rules, the entire community would be more stable. That's the goal, right? The book talks then about the United States Constitution and policy in that regard. And the Constitution is a collection of articles and amendments codifying how U.S. government and citizens, what are their rights, right? And it built a framework for even changing it. That's important in policy too, right? And so the lessons from the Constitution, most importantly, is that our policies need to be dynamic enough to adjust to changing environments, whether it's Hammurabi's code or elsewhere. Okay, so with policy today, we focus on organizations for which we're writing information security policies, right? And we want to apply guiding principles in that effort, right? Guiding principles, as I mentioned, set the tone for corporate culture and synthesize the fundamental philosophy or the beliefs. Page 6 of the book gives a good example of Toyota's guiding principles in their corporate culture. You may want to review that. Now, as I mentioned, not all guiding principles are good, right? As a matter of fact, there are companies for whom greed and exploitation and contempt are unspoken yet powerful guiding principles. I've worked in them. What about, no, I didn't work in this, but what about even child labor? There was a time when that was allowed. The Charles Dickens movies largely built around some of that, right? And so things change over time. Now, corporate culture is also part of this conversation that we'll have. And so corporate cultures are often classified by how corporations treat their employees and their customers. And they're usually classified, according to the book at least, as negative, neutral, or positive. And you can read more about that in the book. So the book does give a nice description of an example of a corporate policy and its impact. And it talks about two companies and a data breach, right? And how company A versus company B. Company A may blame others and fire people. Company B maybe will solicit internal and external feedback, research new controls, or implement enhancements and inform customers, right? A or B, which would you want to work for? This is going to have policy will result from that type of culture, right? And so in practice, we want to develop public trust and apply concepts of due care and due diligence, right? We expect the information we provide will be protected, don't we, as individuals, from unauthorized disclosure, not be intentionally altered or used for other than its intended purpose, right? And so we want to build policy that does things like that. Now, information security policy policy is going to codify those guiding principles, and it's going to shape behaviors, right? So information security policy is a directive that defines how the organization is going to protect its information assets and information systems and ensure compliance with legal and regulatory requirements, right? And maintain support for what are the company's guiding principles, right? And there is a good FYI on page 8 of the book, Information Assets. So information is data, but it's data with context, right? And an asset is a resource with value. And it's an asset that was step 1 of risk management assessment that we talked about in previous conversations. So an information asset is the term applied to information that an organization uses to conduct its business. And that's what we're going to set policy on in this case. Now, successful policy characteristics are listed here. They are addressed on pages 8 through 10 of the book. You can read that for yourself. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I did want to say policy does need to be endorsed by senior management. We'll talk about that in governance, an executive steering committee or the board, and it needs to be enforceable, endorsed and enforceable, and all the rest apply too, so make sure you review those. For example, when it's endorsed and enforceable, here's a tie between those. Nothing will doom policy quicker than having management ignore it, or worse, disobey or circumvent it. I used to have a boss who was a group VP who would piggyback and say, I don't need to swipe my card. Yes, you do. It's policy to get in the door. Anyhow, needs to be relevant. Policy writing, to be relevant, needs to be a thoughtful process and take into account the environment. We're going to talk about writing policy in chapter 2. Needs to be a realistic, right? If you engage constituents in policy development, we want to acknowledge challenges and provide training and consistently enforce policies, and employees will be more likely to accept them. You can read the rest for yourself. It's very interesting. And those are the characteristics you will want to have in your policy, right? So continuing then with the policy. So the government plays a role, as we started out this chapter talking about. So information security is complex, and weaknesses in one organization do affect another. So there are times when the government has felt the need to intervene, and they have created regulation like the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, which is a Financial Modernization Act, or HIPAA is another good example. You can read about those. We talk about them in almost every class, so I won't spend too much time on them. But you can read more about those on pages 13 and 14. On page 14 is a little bit about HIPAA. FERPA would apply to you guys as students, and that's addressed on page 15. It's the privacy of your student record governed by federal law, right? But the federal government isn't doing it all. The state leaders are also doing a lot. So Congress succeeds in some ways and fails in others, right? And states have taken this seriously. An example of that is the California Consumer Privacy Act, which isn't addressed on this slide. These notes on this slide refer to the book, and those are important milestones in state activity, but a current one is CCPA, which is changing the way the United States views data that companies receive. And it's a little closer to GDPR. In fact, it's better than GDPR in my view. It takes it because CCPA's definitions are extra personal, meaning that it includes the data that is not specific to an individual, but is categorized even to a household, where GDPR is exclusively about the individual. And then, of course, is the information security policy life cycle, which begins on page 16. You can read some more about that. You want to notice on page 17 policy development. Note these because you'll be writing